Voice of Geekdom is now on Patreon. Please check out the link in the description to find out how you could gain access to premium content and social features. Hello Tolkien geeks. Amazon's teaser trailer came out over 2 weeks ago now, and one of the biggest eye-openers, as Sam Gamgee might say,
there's an eye-opener and no mistake,
was their portrayal of Galadriel in armour, carrying a sword, and generally being shown in an action hero role. Now, though I will be continuing to cover the television show here on the channel, now and in the future, I don't want this channel to become only about that adaptation, of course. But I've mentioned several times before on the channel that Galadriel had several different and largely mutually exclusive versions of her backstory to consider, and so I've been meaning to write a video or two about her complicated backstory for a little while. And along with the fact that we've just recently reached the stage in my Silmarillion Explained series where she is effectively written out of the Quenta, the timing seems just right to explore this a little. In 1973, the final year of Tolkien's life, he wrote a letter in response to a Mrs. Catherine Findlay, who had asked about the meaning of Galadriel's name. Tolkien replied that it was a Sindarin name that meant maiden crowned with gleaming hair. It is a secondary name given to her in her youth in the far past, because she had long hair which glistened like gold, but was also shot with silver. She was then of Amazon disposition, and bound up her hair as a crown when taking part in athletic feats. So, at one point, according to Tolkien, she was of Amazon disposition. No pun intended. This interesting quote gives us an idea of Tolkien's eventual understanding of her origins. But Galadriel's various backstories became something of an entanglement for Christopher Tolkien to sort through when he came to draft and edit a publishable version of the Silmarillion. Tolkien's son and literary executor comments on this in Unfinished Tales. There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, and it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions, or to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings. This is true of many plot threads in the Middle-earth legendarium. Tolkien's continued explorations of these characters, and of the philosophical themes of his stories, revealed new dimensions to the stories over time, and plot elements changed, forming a body of legend that was as fluid as it was contradictory. I find that, generally speaking, the way to look at this is to take the view that all of these versions may contain some truth to them in our collective imaginative landscapes. These stories are a body of legend which is open to interpretation, which, incidentally, in Galadriel's case at least, gives a lot of scope for a creative approach to any adaptation of her story. Tolkien's approach to world-building was very much an iterative one, and that can readily be seen in any serious study of the History of Middle-earth series. The Peoples of Middle-earth, the final volume of the History of Middle-earth series, gives us the very first drafts of the Lord of the Rings appendices, which, as you might imagine if you've read the appendices, are chock full of fascinating reading. An entry in the draft timeline of the Second Age, which later in a truncated form became the section on the Second Age in Appendix B, The Tale of Years, lists Galadriel as Lady Galadriel of the Noldor, sister of Gil-galad. This, according to Christopher, corresponds with a very, very early conception of her in a draft version of the Rings of Power and the Third Age from the Silmarillion, where she is listed as a daughter of Felagund the Fair. That's Felagund, who, in every other accepted tradition of the character, was Galadriel's older brother. Some versions of these stories have more truth to them than others, This was an idea that he abandoned very early on. Gil-galad, similarly, had an origin story which was often revised by the author over the decades, leading to a famous, self-acknowledged editorial mistake in The Silmarillion by Christopher regarding Gil-galad's parentage, though the changes were more subtle than those of Galadriel as far as they relate to the plot. But that's an investigation for another time. But in fact, not just Galadriel and Gil-galad, but the whole House of Finwë underwent numerous revisions from around this time up until Tolkien's death in 1973. Names were passed around from one character to another, and the structure of the family tree was altered. At the point at which The Lord of the Rings was written and published, Finrod was the name given to the character that we now know as Finarfin in The Silmarillion. The character that we now know as Finrod was, at that time, called Inglor Felagund, and there is still a legacy reference to this name in The Lord of the Rings. The High Elf Gildor Inglorion, whom Frodo, Sam and Pippin meet while still travelling in the Shire, and who announces himself as Gildor Inglorion of the House of Finrod, retains the patronym Inglorion, which linguistically marks him as the son of Inglor, i.e. the character who will later be known as Finrod, as I said. So, in other words, Gildor was really, to substitute the later better-known names, Gildor, son of Finrod of the House of Finarfin, at the time of his conception. Effectively, by using the later names in the published Silmarillion, but not changing the names of these characters in later editions of The Lord of the Rings, Christopher ended up retconning The Lord of the Rings after the fact, in a sense. It's a relatively inconsequential change, since Tolkien never devised any notable further backstory for Gildor. But it's also a perfect demonstration of how convoluted the reworking of the text was, that there are still artifacts of this in the final versions of both texts. If it seems as though we're getting off topic here, I only mention this just to demonstrate that Christopher wasn't kidding when he said that there is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, who were inserted right in the middle of all of these various alterations. Galadriel, and by extension Celeborn, were new characters in The Lord of the Rings, and together presented a special case. It gave Tolkien an enormous reason to retcon the Silmarillion in order to flesh out and incorporate their stories, and he did so until quite literally the very last month of his life. A fact that makes it seem quite sad and unfortunate that what we get of her in the published Silmarillion seems so minimal. Let's run through some of the instances in which Tolkien wrote a larger role for Galadriel than the material that Christopher ended up using. In Morgoth's Ring, the complete text of The Annals of Aman is given, which was Tolkien's first revision of the history of the Elder Days from the post-Lord of the Rings era, covering the period of history up until the flight of the Noldor. Much of the Galadriel material included in the early Quenta Silmarillion, which was in the published version, has its origins in this text. Christopher here also includes a marginal note that he decided not to include in the Silmarillion. Tolkien says here that Finrod and Galadriel, whose husband was of the Teleri, fought against Feanor in defence of Alqualonde. This would have contradicted the later Galadriel and Celeborn material that Christopher did include, the version where Galadriel first met Celeborn in Doriath, so presumably this is why it didn't make the cut. Although Christopher could have chosen to cut out or alter the part in parentheses to make it fit. In Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien paraphrases a note that Tolkien wrote in the very last month of his life, from which we can pull out the following snippet, which backs up that earlier edition from Morgoth's Ring about the fighting at Alqualonde. In Feanor's revolt that followed the darkening of Valinor, Galadriel had no part. Indeed, she with Celeborn fought heroically in defence of Alqualonde against the assault of the Noldor, and Celeborn's ship was saved from them. In this version, Galadriel never followed Feanor's rebellion at all, as she does in the published Silmarillion, but her fighting against the Feanorians during the first kinslaying remained. Celeborn's origins changed perhaps even more than Galadriel's did. Here he was a prince of the Teleri in the west, rather than one of the Sindar. Celeborn's ship, which was referenced here, was the ship that they sailed to Middle-earth in together. They did so still without the permission of the Valar, but because they did so during the period of Feanor's rebellion, they still fell under the doom of Mandos. Also in Unfinished Tales, Christopher includes an excerpt from what he characterises as a very late and primarily philological essay, which reads, "So it came to pass that when the light of Valinor failed, forever as the Noldor thought, she joined the rebellion against the Valar who commanded them to stay, and once she had set foot upon that road of exile, she would not relent, but rejected the last message of the Valar, and came under the doom of Mandos. Even after the merciless assault upon the Teleri and the rape of their ships, though she fought fiercely against Feanor in defence of her mother's kin, she did not turn back. Her pride was unwilling to return, a defeated suppliant for pardon, but now she burned with desire to follow Feanor with her anger to whatever lands he might come, and to thwart him in all ways that she could. Pride still moved her when, at the end of the Elder Days, after the final overthrow of Morgoth, she refused the pardon of the Valar for all who had fought against him, and remained in Middle-earth." Presumably this was written a little earlier than that previous note. Here, in this version, she still partook in Feanor's rebellion. We can see that this idea of her fighting Feanor and his sons at Alqualonde persisted from Tolkien's first attempts to integrate her into the Silmarillion, right up until his death. This was obviously important to Tolkien, despite Christopher's editorial conservatism preventing him from including it. And if this seems like a criticism of Christopher, it's not supposed to be, as I can completely appreciate the complexity of the texts he was working with. This essay also backs up the quotation from Tolkien's letter regarding Galadriel's Amazon disposition by providing a gloss for Galadriel's older mother name, which was, of course, a Quenya name. Her mother name was Nerwen, Man-Maiden, and she grew to be tall beyond the measure even of the women of the Noldor. She was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the lore masters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. Unfortunately, we can't tell too much about her disposition, whether Amazonian or otherwise, later on in the chronology from any of these quotes. Going back to the very first quote that I've cited here, from that letter to Mrs. Findlay, Tolkien states only that at that time was she of Amazon disposition, meaning at the time when she was given that name, which was relatively early in her life. And there doesn't appear to be any evidence that she fought physically, either in the Wars of Beleriand or in the major wars against Sauron in the Second Age. But absence of evidence does not necessarily equate to evidence of absence, as the saying goes. There is one more incident of Galadriel's involvement in warfare which we should cover, and then I'll finish with my conclusions about the character. In The Lord of the Rings Appendix B, we are told that, following the destruction of the One Ring, further north in the Vales of the Anduin, where Lorien was locked in conflict with the invading forces of Dol Guldur in Mirkwood, Celeborn and Galadriel finally led a force of elves to defeat Sauron's forces. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods on the borders, the assaults were driven back, and when the shadow passed, Celeborn came forth and led the host of Lorien over Anduin in many boats. They took Dol Guldur, and Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. I would say that this was certainly an incident where Galadriel was using powerful magic to destroy Sauron's fortress, and the fact that Celeborn was leading the army of the Galathrim from Lorien implies that Galadriel was not a martial combatant. The language used here was highly reminiscent of the description of Luthien liberating Tol Sirion from Sauron in the Silmarillion. Galadriel throwing down the walls and laying bare the pits of Dol Guldur was almost the exact same phrasing used by Tolkien in that story, wherein we were told that Luthien declared her power, and the spell was loosed that bound stone to stone. Definite elf magic stuff going on here. I think that Galadriel was a tall, strong, powerful elf woman, just as she has always been described, and that she was able to fight when the need arose. The textual evidence for this is very strong, and this seemed to grow in Tolkien's mind after The Lord of the Rings, rather than diminish. Not only that, but the persistence of the idea that she fought at Alqualonde in Tolkien's writings about her means that this forms my personal headcanon about this event, which the published Silmarillion doesn't even really specifically contradict. I don't count her as merely a warrior, by any stretch, but I think that this is an aspect of her character that more casual fans of Tolkien's writings can be led to undervalue. I also think that, over time, she entered into physical martial combat situations with the forces of evil less and less often, and that she did much more to fight Sauron with her mind than with her fists, especially after taking over the rulership of Lothlorien, which we know that she protected with her magics, much as her mentor, Melian, had done in Doriath in the First Age. I would want to see both aspects of this character depicted in an adaptation of her earlier years. A well-written interpretation of this character would seek to demonstrate her growth and emerging maturity as a leader in Middle-earth as major themes of her story arc.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe tier Patreon supporters: Erin M, Stephen Stark the Maya from Here Be Dragons, Kelly the Jaded Shipwright, Alexander Petrov, Joshua Boniface, and our newest axe wielder, A.N. Kreutzberg.